Now, the sale room of an old and famous firm of book auctioneers in London is, of course, a great meeting place for collectors, librarians, dealers. I mean, not only when the auction is in progress, but perhaps even more notably, when the books that are coming up for sale are first put on view. Now, it was in just such a sale room that the remarkable series of events began, which were detailed to me not many months ago by the person whom they principally affected, namely Mr. James Denton, MA, FSA, sometime of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, now or lately of Rendcombe Manor in the county of Warwick. On a certain spring day, and it wasn't very long ago, he was in London for a few days on business connected principally with the furnishing of the house which he'd just finished building at Rendcombe. Now, it may disappoint you to learn that Rendcombe Manor was new. That I cannot help. There had been an old house, but it was not remarkable for beauty or interest. And even if it had been, neither beauty nor interest would have protected it from the fire, which about 2 years before the date of this story had quite razed it to the ground. I'm glad to say that the most valuable items inside it were saved and that it was fully insured. And so it was with a comparatively light heart that Mr. Denton was able to face the task of building a new and considerably more convenient dwelling for himself and his aunt, who contributed his whole menage. Now, being in London with some time on his hands and not far from the sale room at which I've hinted, Mr. Denton thought he'd spend an hour or so browsing there upon the chance of finding something bearing upon the history or topography of his part of Warwickshire. He accordingly turned in, purchased a catalogue, and ascended to the sale room, where, as usual, the books were disposed in cases or laid out upon the long tables. Now, at the shelves, or seated at these tables, were figures, many of whom were familiar to Denton, and he exchanged nods and greetings with several of them, and then he settled down to examine the catalogue and note likely items. Now, he'd made good progress through about 200 of the 500 lots, when a hand was laid on his shoulder, and he looked up. Now, his interrupter was one of those intelligent men with a pointed beard and a flannel shirt, of whom the last quarter of the 19th century was, it seems to me, very prolific. Now, it's no part of my plan to repeat the whole conversation which ensued between these two men. I shall content myself with stating that it largely confined to common acquaintances, to the nephew of Mr. Denton's friend, who'd recently married and settled in Chelsea, to the sister-in-law of Mr. Denton's friend, who had been seriously indisposed, but fortunately was now much better, and to a piece of china which Mr. Denton's friend had purchased some months before at a price much below its true value. Now, from that, you will rightly infer that the conversation was rather in the nature of a monologue. In due time, however, the friend bethought himself that Mr. Denton was there for his own purposes, and he asked him, "Are you looking for anything in particular, Denton? I don't think there's much in this lot." "No," said Denton. "No. Well, I must say I had heard that there'd be some Warwickshire collections, but I don't see anything in the catalogue." "Really? Oh, no, I'm pretty sure I noticed something like a Warwickshire Diary, I think it was. Oh, God, what was the name now? Drayton, Potter, began with a P or a D, I'm certain of that. Here we are, yeah, Poynter, that was it. And yeah, look, it's a diary, lot 486. Might be of interest. Yeah. Well, now listen, I've got to be getting on, I'm afraid, but you will look us up, won't you, next time you're in town? In fact, I'll tell you what, why not come by this afternoon? We've got a little music planned. Yeah, Toby Hargreaves' sister's bringing her cello round at about 4. Might be rather entertaining. No? No. No, well, fair enough, and not to everyone's taste, perhaps. Anyway, cheerio, next time, perhaps. And off he went. Now, Mr. Denton looked at his watch, and he found to his confusion that he could spare no more than a moment before retrieving his luggage and going for the train. But that moment was long enough to show him that there were 4 largish volumes of Mr. Poynter's diary, and that it concerned the years about 1710, and that there seemed to be a good many insertions in it of various kinds. It seemed just about worth leaving a commission of £25 for it, and this he was able to do because his usual agent entered the room as he was on the point of leaving it. That evening he rejoined his aunt at their temporary abode, which was a small dower house a few hundred yards from the manor itself. And on the following morning, the two resumed a discussion that had now lasted for some weeks as to the equipment of the new house. Mr. Denton laid before his relative a statement of the results of his visits to town, particulars of carpets, of chairs, of wardrobes, and of bedroom china. "Yeah, well, very good, James dear," said his aunt, "but I don't see any chintzes here. Didn't you go to Beale's?" "Ah," Mr. Denton slapped his forehead. "Oh, drat it. Oh, I'm sorry, Auntie. Ah, curses. That's the one thing that I missed. And the fact is, I was on my way there, and I happened to be passing Robbins's." "Oh, James!" His aunt threw up her hands. "Robbins's! So I suppose the next thing will be another parcel of horrible old books turning up, bought for some outrageous price." I do think, James, when I'm taking all this trouble for you, you might at least try to remember the one or two things which I specially begged you to see after. I mean, it's not as if I was asking for myself, is it? I mean, I don't know whether you think that I get any pleasure out of all of this, James, but if so, I can assure you that it's very much the reverse. The thought and the worry and the trouble I have over it all, you've no idea. And all you have to do is go to the shops and order some things. Oh, look, Auntie, yeah, well, that's all very well, dear, yes, and I don't want to speak sharply, and I'm sure you're sorry, but well, you must know how vexing it is, particularly as it delays the whole of our business for who knows how long. Today's Wednesday, the Simpsons are coming tomorrow, and you can't leave them. And then on Saturday, we've got friends coming for tennis. Yeah, don't you look like that, James? We must occasionally be civil to our neighbours, mustn't we? I mean, you wouldn't want it said that we were perfect bears, would you? No. Anyway, what was I saying? Well, anyway, it comes to this, that it'll be Thursday next week at the earliest before you can go to town again, and until we've decided upon the chintzes, it's impossible to settle upon a single other thing. Well, Mr. Denton ventured to suggest that as the paint and wallpapers had already been dealt with, that was too severe a view. But this his aunt was not prepared to admit at that moment, nor indeed was there any propositions he could have advanced which she would have found herself able to accept. As the day went on, however, her mood softened a little, and she examined with lessening disfavour the samples and price lists submitted by her nephew, even in some cases giving a qualified approval to his choice. I mean, as for him, he was naturally somewhat dashed by the consciousness of a duty unfulfilled, but more so by the prospect of a lawn tennis party, which, although an inevitable evil in August, he had thought there was no occasion to fear in May. He was to some extent cheered up the next morning, however, by the arrival of the news that he had secured, at the price of £12 10s, the 4 volumes of Mr. Poynter's diary, and still more by the arrival the next day of the books themselves. Now, the necessity of taking Mr. and Mrs. Simpson for a drive on Saturday morning and of attending to his neighbours and guests that afternoon prevented him from doing more than open the parcel until the party had retired to bed on the Saturday night. But then he was able to make certain of the fact that, yes, I mean, he'd hitherto only suspected this, but what he'd acquired was the diary of Mr. William Poynter, Squire of Accrington, which was only about 4 miles from his own parish. Now, this was in fact the same Poynter who was for a time a member of the Circle of Oxford Antiquaries, the centre of which was Thomas Hearne, and with whom Hearne seems ultimately to have quarrelled, which is a not uncommon episode in the career of that excellent man. Now, as is the case with Hearne's own collections, Poynter's diary contained a good many notes, some printed books, and descriptions of coins and other antiquities that had been brought to his notice. There were drafts of letters on various subjects, and of course a chronicle of daily events. The description in the sale catalogue, however, had given Mr. Denton no idea of the amount of interest which seemed to lie within the book, and he sat up reading in the first of the 4 volumes until a very late hour. On the Sunday morning, after church, his aunt came into the study and was diverted from what she'd been going to tell him by the sight of the 4 brown leather quartos on the table. "What are these, James?" "Oh, yuck! Are these the horrid things that made you forget my chintzes? Oh, how disgusting! What did you pay for them, I'd like to know? Over £10, I bet. Oh, James, it really is sinful. Well, all right, if you have the money to throw away on this kind of thing, there can be no reason why you should not subscribe, and subscribe handsomely, to my Anti-Vivisection League. Now, no, James, there is not indeed, and I shall be very seriously annoyed if..." "What? Who did you say wrote them?" "Old Mr. Poynter? What, Poynter of Accrington? Oh, yes. Well, no. I mean, no, of course there is some interest in getting together old papers about the neighbourhood. But £10, James! She picked up one of the volumes, not that which her nephew had been reading, and opened it at random, dashing it to the floor the next instant with a cry of disgust as an earwig fell from between the pages. Ew! Mr. Denton picked up the book with a smothered expletive. Hey, Auntie, please, poor book. I think you're being rather hard on Mr. Poynter. Yes, well, I beg his pardon, James, but you know I can't abide those nasty creatures. Let me see if I've done any mischief. No, don't worry. I think it's all well. But hey, Auntie, look what you've opened him on. Ooh, gosh. Yes, look at that, James. How very interesting. And unpin it. Let me have a proper look. Well, it was a piece of patterned fabric about the size of the quarto page to which it was fastened by an old-fashioned pin. James did detach it and handed it to his aunt. Now, I don't know exactly what the fabric was, but it had a design printed upon it which completely fascinated Miss Denton. I mean, she went into raptures over it, held it against the wall, made Denton do the same so she might contemplate it from a distance. And then she pored over it at close quarters and ended her examination by expressing in the warmest terms her appreciation of the taste of the ancient Mr. Poynter, who had had the happy idea of preserving the sample in his diary. Oh, it is a most charming pattern, she said. Quite remarkable. Look how delightfully the lines ripple. It rather reminds one of hair, doesn't it? And then these knots of ribbon at intervals. They give just the relief of colour that's wanted. I do wonder. Well, I was going to say, Auntie, interrupted Denton, I wonder if it would cost much to have it copied for our curtains. Copied? Oh, how could you have it copied, James? Well, I don't know the details, I admit, but I suppose it's a printed pattern and that you could have a block cut from it in wood or metal. Oh, James, what a capital idea. Yes. I'm almost inclined to be glad that you forgot the chintzes on Monday. At any rate, I will promise to forgive and forget if you can get this lovely old thing copied. God, no one will have anything the least like it. And mind you, James, we won't allow it to be sold. Now, I must go now. I've totally forgotten what I came in to say, but never mind. I'm sure that it'll keep. Well, after his aunt had gone, James Denton devoted a few minutes to examining the pattern more closely. I must say he was puzzled to think why it should have struck his aunt so forcibly. It didn't seem to him especially remarkable, not very pretty. I mean, no doubt it was suitable enough for a curtain pattern. It ran in vertical bands, and there was some indication that these were intended to converge at the top. She was right, too, in thinking that these bands resembled rippling tresses of hair. Anyway, the main thing he realized was to find out who could reproduce this kind of thing. And not to delay you over this portion of the story, trade directories were consulted, a list of likely firms was made out, and Mr. Denton fixed a day for calling on some of them with his sample. Now, the first two visits that he paid were unsuccessful, but there is luck in odd numbers, and the firm in Bermondsey, which was third on his list, was accustomed to handling exactly this kind of work. The evidence that they were able to produce justified their being entrusted with the job, and Mr. Cattle, the manager, took a fervent personal interest in it. Oh, yes. It's heartrending, isn't it, sir? To picture the quantity of really lovely medieval stuff like this that lies well nigh unnoticed in many of our residential country houses. Much of it in peril, I take it, as being cast aside as so much rubbish. What is it that William Shakespeare says? Unconsidered trifles. I often say he has a word for us all, sir, does William Shakespeare. Well, it's I say Shakespeare, but I'm aware that not everyone holds with me there. I had something of an upset the other day, sir, when a gentleman come in, a titled man he was, and he told me that he wrote on the topic, and I happened to cite something about Hercules and the painted cloth. Deary me, you never saw such a pother. But as to this, which you have kindly confided to us, yes, now that is a piece of work which we shall take a real enthusiasm in achieving to the very best of our ability. What man has done, as I was observing only a few weeks back, man can do again. And in 3 or 4 weeks' time, all being well, we shall hope to lay before you evidence to that effect, sir. Now, take down the address, Mr. Higgins, if you please. Well, about a month later, being advised that some samples were ready for his inspection, Mr. Denton travelled to Bermondsey again, and had, it seems, reason to be satisfied with the faithfulness of the reproduction of his design. It had not been finished at the top so that the vertical bands joined, but something still needed to be done in the way of matching the colour to the original. Now, Mr. Cattle had various suggestions of a technical kind to offer, which I shall not trouble you with now. But he also had views as to the general desirability of the pattern, which were vaguely adverse. You say, sir, you don't want this to be supplied to anyone else except personal friends, equipped with an authorisation from yourself, sir. Yeah, it shall be done. No, I quite understand your wish to keep it exclusive. Lends it a catch it, does it not, to the suite? What's every man's, it has been said, is no man's. Yeah. Do you think it would be popular if it were generally obtainable? Asked Denton. Well, no, I hardly think it, actually, sir. No, I wouldn't say popular. I mean, it wasn't popular with the man that cut the block, was it, Mr. Higgins? Why, did he find it a difficult job? Well, he'd no call to, sir. Well, the fact is that the artistic temperament, and our men are artists, sir, every one of them, well, it's apt to take on some strange likes or dislikes, isn't it? And, well, this was an example. The twice or thrice that I went to inspect his progress, well, I mean, language, sir, I could understand because that's habitual to him. But real distaste for what I should call a dainty enough thing, I could not, nor am I now, able to fathom. It seemed, said Mr. Cattle, looking narrowly upon Mr. Denton, as if the man scented something almost evil in the design. Really? Well, I can't say I see anything sinister in it myself. Neither can I, sir. Neither can I. In fact, I said as much to Gatwick. Come on, Gatwick, I said. What's to do here? What is the reason of your prejudice? I can call it nothing more than that. But no explanation was forthcoming, and I was reduced, as I am now, to a shrug of the shoulders and a cui bono. But here it is, sir, now. And with that, the technical side of the question came to the front again. Now, during August and September, the Dentons were away from the manor, and it wasn't therefore until October was well in there's a sufficient quantity of the stuff had been manufactured to furnish curtains for the 2 or 3 or 4 bedrooms which they're to be fitted up with. At last, however, on the feast of St. Simon and St. Jude, aunt and nephew returned from a short visit to find all completed, and their satisfaction at the general effect was very great indeed. The new curtains agreed to admiration with their surroundings, and when Mr. Denton was dressing for dinner and took stock of his room, in which a large amount of the chintz was displayed, he congratulated himself on the luck which had made him forget his aunt's commission and had put into his hands this extremely effective means of remedying his mistake. The pattern was, as he said himself at dinner, so restful and yet very far from being dull. And Miss Denton, who, by the way, had none of the stuff in her own room, was much disposed to agree with him. At breakfast the next morning, however, he was inclined slightly to qualify his satisfaction. There is one thing I rather regret, Auntie, he said, that we allowed them to join up the vertical bands at the pattern at the top. I think it would have been better to leave that alone. Oh, said his aunt. Yes. I mean, when I was reading in bed last night, they kept catching my eye. I mean, I found myself constantly looking across at them every now and again when there was no edge. And it was as if somebody, I don't know, kept peeping out from between the curtains in some place or other. I think that was due to the joining up of the bands at the top, you see. The only other thing that really bothered me was the wind. Really, James? I thought it was a perfectly still night. Well, perhaps it was. Perhaps it was only on my side of the house, but no, there was certainly enough to rustle and move the curtains more than I wanted. Well, that night, a bachelor friend of Denton's came to stay. He was lodged in a room on the same floor as his host. But at the end of this long passageway, halfway down of which was a red baize door, which had been put there to cut off the draught and to intercept noise. After dinner, the party of three had separated. Miss Denton first, the two men at about 11. James Denton, not yet inclined to bed, sat down in the armchair in his room and read for some time. And then he dozed, and then he woke and bethought himself that his brown spaniel, which ordinarily slept in his room, had not come upstairs with him. And then he thought he was mistaken, for happening to move his hand, which hung over the edge of the arm of the chair within a few inches of the floor, he felt on the back of it just the slightest touch of the surface of hair, and stretching it out in that direction, he stroked and patted a rounded something. But the feel of it, and still more, the fact that instead of a responsive dog-like movement, absolute stillness greeted his touch, made him look over the arm. What he'd been touching rose to meet him. It was in the attitude of one that had crept along the floor on its belly. It was a human figure, so far as could be collected, but of the face, which was now rising to within a few inches of his own, no feature was discernible, only hair. Shapeless as it was, there was about it so horrible an air of menace that as he bounded from his chair and rushed from the room, James Denton heard himself moaning with fear, and doubtless he did right to fly, because as he dashed into the baize door that cut the passage in two, and forgetting that it opened towards him, beat against it with all the force that was in him, he felt a soft, ineffectual tearing at his back, which all the same seemed to be growing in power, as if the hand, or whatever was worse than a hand, were becoming more material as the pursuer's rage was concentrated. And then he remembered the trick of the door. He got it open, slammed it behind him, gained his friend's room. And that is all that we need to know. Now, it seems curious, I agree, that during all the time that had elapsed since the purchase of Mr. Poynter's diary, James Denton should not have sought an explanation of the pattern that had been pinned into it. But you see, he'd read the whole diary very thoroughly without finding any mention of it, and he concluded that there was therefore nothing to be said. However, on leaving Rendcombe Manor, he did not know whether for good, as he naturally insisted upon doing on the day after experiencing the horror, he took the diary with him, and at his seaside lodgings he examined more narrowly the portion whence the pattern had been taken. What he remembered having suspected about it turned out to be correct. 2 or 3 leaves were pasted together, but written upon, as was patent when they were held up to the light. Now, they yielded easily enough to steaming because the paste had lost much of its strength. And they contained something that I think is relevant to the pattern. This entry was made in 1707. Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me this day much of young Sir Everard Charlotte, whom he remembered a commoner of University College, and thought was of the same family of Dr. Arthur Charlotte, now master of the college. This Charlotte was a personable young gentleman, but a loose atheistical companion and a great lifter, as they then called the hard drinkers, and for what I now do know, do so still. He was noted and subject to several censures at different times for his extravagances, and if the full history of his debaucheries had been known, no doubt he would have been expelled from college. He was a very beautiful person, and constantly wore his own hair, which was very abundant, and from which, and his loose way of living, the cant name for him was Absalom. And he was accustomed to say that indeed he believed he had shortened old David's days, meaning his father, Sir Job Charnock, an old worthy cavalier. Mr. Carsbury said that he remembers not the year of Sir Everett Charnock's death, but that it was 1692 or 1693. He died suddenly in October. Having seen him in such topping spirits the night before, Mr. Casbury was much amazed when he learned the news. He'd been found in the town ditch, and his hair, as was said, had been plucked clean off his head. Most bells in Oxford are rung out for him, being a nobleman, and he was buried the next night in St. Peter's in the East. But 2 years after, as he was being moved to his country estate by his successor, it was said that the coffin, breaking by mischance, proved quite to be full of hair, which sounds fabulous, but yet I believe precedents are upon record, as in Dr. Plott's History of Staffordshire. His chambers being afterwards stripped, Mr. Casbury came by part of the hangings of it, and 'twas said that this Charlotte had designed expressly for a memorial of his hair, giving the fellow that drew it a lock to work by, and the piece which I've fastened in here was parcel of the same, the hangings, which Mr. Carsbury gave to me. He said he believed that there was a subtlety in the drawing, but had never yet discovered it, nor much liked to pore over it. Well, the money that had been spent on those curtains might as well have been thrown into the fire, as the curtains were themselves. Mr. Cattle's comments upon it, when he heard the story, took the form of a quotation from Shakespeare. You might be familiar with it yourselves. It begins with the words, "There are more things